Hello, everybody. We thought it was certainly appropriate to give you an update as to the events that first began last Thursday, September 13th. Give you some perspective and provide some additional information. I know that the board has significant knowledge as relates to many of these things, but the public may or may not, depending upon how communication has developed over the last week plus. I would recognize, first of all those families displaced, all those families that were impacted. This was tragic in many ways, fortunate in some, in that given the time of the day, the weather, the fact that nobody was injured, no firefighter was injured, no resident was injured. We did not have some of the same sort of injury, certainly in loss of life, and some of the other issues that came up in some of the other communities. So if there is something fortunate to take from a very tragic circumstance that continues to go on, and will go on, quite frankly, for several weeks, is that in some cases, or for some reasons, the factors that affected what happened in North Andover certainly could have been worse. I'd also like to take the opportunity to recognize not only these folks who sit in the back row, and I can talk a little bit about them, but everybody else. I mean, it's impossible. I'm not, you folks know that I'm not the most skilled at remembering everybody who should be complimented or supported or acknowledged, but it is in some ways almost impossible to recognize that. Because in addition to the staff who have been extraordinary, the public safety folks, the first responders who have been beyond extraordinary, and the regional support and outpouring from other public safety agencies, from the state and federal officials, from the governor's office, the governor himself, and really the neighbor-to-neighbor, street-to-street support that the community has shown since September 13th is not only a recognition of the community that we support, live and work in, but also of the state and country that we live in. We're fortunate to possess the skill combined with an empathy that just doesn't exist everywhere. And so for those of you who could have seen the almost surreal setting of September 13th and 14th especially, from the road, from the air, if you could have seen it, certainly those folks who were impacted directly, it was a time that will resonate with all of us for quite a while, and we should take from that we're very, very fortunate to be surrounded by good people, work hard, and who care. So I think I want to recognize all of those folks. Again, most of the most directly impacted senior staff members, all of these folks have worked since September 13th, I think straight through in one form or another, some of them close to 24 hours a day, certainly parts of every day since that point. What happened after the immediate events of September 13th, and we'll go through those, there are ongoing things every day, right? The discussion hasn't stopped, and I think one of the things I want the residents to recognize, whether you're impacted or not, is there continues to be meetings every day and discussions every day and effort exerted every day by these folks, by other staff members, by the Board of Selectmen to make sure that we get through the balance of what this extraordinary event has caused in terms of impact on people's lives. So with that, again, I know it's a broad brush, and at some point we'll probably in the future be able to take a step back and truly reflect on everybody's impact, but I think it's important to recognize that there was a tremendous amount of people that led a response and continue to lead a response as relates to the gas crisis. So let's talk about that. So first up is a map of the affected area. It's a rough map, in essence, represents what they refer to as South Lawrence, parts of Andover, specifically around their Main Street corridor, and what Columbia Gas refers to as Zone 8 and Zone 7 in North Andover, in broad terms, bounded by Mass Ave, Main Street, Waverly, and Chickering, plus or minus within those spaces. There's some extensions across Chickering, diagonally toward DPW, but generally that gives you a sense of where the sort of meets and bounds were of the event. The event was caused by an overpressurization of the low-pressure gas side of the gas system. The gas system has low-pressure lines and high-pressure lines, It was on the low-pressure side that there was an overpressurization. I will leave to the NTSB, a federal agency, and the state and others to determine the specific nature of what went on, who's at fault, and everything associated with that. We just know that the event took place. And by late afternoon on that Thursday, became aware, as we received 31 to 32 calls of service, depending on how you march those up, and calls to the dispatch area north of 200, that something was ongoing. And if you've listened to the dispatch tape, the fire response dispatch tape, which I have posted online as well, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary in terms of the response. It's extraordinary in terms of the fear, in many ways, for someone who's a civilian like myself listening to what was going on. It's tremendous in terms of the balance and composure of the professionals who responded. And at the same time, you realize you're in an environment that you can't quite figure out what's going on. You don't know what the reason is why there's multiple fires at Andover, North Andover, and Lawrence. It's just not a common occurrence. So all of the things you could imagine crossed your mind at the time you're listening to this. Begin around 4, again, a little earlier than 4 p.m. The fires tragically killed one person, that person in South Lawrence, caused dozens of injuries, destroyed homes, and led to the town of North Andover telling all residents they should evacuate their homes if they had gas service. That was early in the evening on Thursday. Mobile command center was stood up in Lawrence for first responders. That happened a little after 5 o'clock, I believe was the time. We had started, there was a command center set up in North Andover specifically as well that was at the St. Michael's School parking lot, originally was the staging area. It just became evident fairly quickly that this was impacting so many people in such a broad range of area that the state mobilized a command center at the former Showcase Cinema in Lawrence to respond regionally to what had turned into a regional issue. 32 properties were impacted in North Andover. Four remain what they call restricted access, 4 have limited access, and 24 had minor damage. And there were more than 200 calls to 911 related to this. For those people driving the streets at the time or in their neighborhoods, even while these fires are going on, you could drive through certain impacted neighborhoods and just smell gas at a level that you realize there was an ongoing issue. As it relates to timeline, on Thursday, we started to tell folks shortly after the event began to evacuate their homes. We were uncertain of the sort of metes and bounds at that point of the event itself, where it began, where it ended. We didn't know the extent of the problem and recommended that they voluntarily evacuate their homes. At this point, emergency management activated to open a shelter at the high school. The staging area for most of the fire apparatus and public safety apparatus was at the middle school. Many of the residents turned out after the fact. There's some data in the right-hand column. We had a total 2,503 residents, non-impacted, who shut off their own gas or had a relative, friend, plumber shut off their gas, which turned into another logistical challenge after the end of the event. Upon identification of the impacted areas in the early of Thursday evening from the command center, National Grid, as the electric company, made the recommendation that the impacted area electricity be shut off as a precaution. We agreed to do that. Electricity, like gas, is not a home-by-home switch. So in essence, 2,000 residents saw our electricity cut, where we had identified, a gas company had identified about 1,517 meters. So more residents lost electricity than did gas as a precaution to make sure there wasn't further sort of impact in those areas. The state had begun to close highway ramps off of 495 to North Andover and the surrounding communities. The emergency management team was identified before mobilized and set up a shelter at the high school. That day didn't really end, although we were showing discrete days. The Thursday, September 13th piece rolls into very, very early on Friday morning. The command center in Lawrence was just remarkable was the only word I can use in terms of the commitment of assets. Mass Emergency Management, State Fire Marshal, our own public safety officials, myself, officials from each of the surrounding communities, the governor, all were in a command center making decisions to try to understand the issue and reduce the impact. Became evident was that all of the meters that were impacted needed to be shut off. And there wasn't any sense yet of whether some were and some weren't. And so Columbia Gas was the lead utility. They owned the utility infrastructure, and Columbia Gas was charged to going door to door to shut off all of the meters. By the way, 1,517 in North Andover, close to 8,600 total between the 3 impacted communities. Lawrence at that point had indicated there was a mandatory evacuation. We just encouraged folks to move from their homes. Columbia Gas began that process somewhere between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. on Friday morning to start the shut-off process at each and every one of the meters. We had both police and fire folks with Columbia Gas staff. I'll never forget that morning. It was remarkably foggy, which we don't see a lot of fog around here, and it was notably foggy. It just seemed almost surreal as they were going door to door in the dark, beginning to shut off the 1,517 meters. As some attempt to make sure that we could control, shut off the impacted area, and then ultimately the goal was to restore electricity. Later on that day, it became evident that there was Columbia Gas was experiencing some real logistical challenges in getting those meters turned off. It was not going as well as anybody planned. Quite frankly, there weren't enough assets in any of the communities to get that done. The governor, based on that response by mid to late afternoon, decided that he would declare a state of emergency, which allowed him to move Columbia Gas aside and bring on Eversource to coordinate the shutoff of the remaining of the gas meters. That was in the late afternoon on Friday. The process ramped up again to begin to shut off each of these meters, 1,517 again in North Andover and about 8,600 in total through the region. Progress was, steadily made and was nearly complete in the early evening of Saturday, September 15th. Not completed, but substantially completed. There was a decision made about whether or not electricity could be turned on at that point. And again, understand when electricity shut off and the process they go through to do that, they can't just flip a switch to bring it all back on. So the decision was made, since we didn't want folks returning home in the middle of the night with questions about their gas, that the more logical step would be to try to get everybody on by 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. And they were able to work through the night and get really close to that. I think, put some stats here, we had, by Sunday morning, 7 a.m. Sunday morning, 92% of all folks had seen the gas shut off in the impacted area and electricity return. They were down to sort of a handful of individual folks, and I think by 10 a.m. that was 99.1%. So at that point, first thing in the morning on Sunday, we made the decision to close the shelter and close the shelter at 1 o'clock. With folks having electricity, the shelter made less sense. We don't often operate shelters. In this case, it was done in conjunction with the American Red Cross, and some of you folks are showing up in remarkable sort of volunteerism and contribution by many of the restaurants. And so we had seen general decrease in the amount of folks at the shelter as the electricity came on, and the decision was made to close the shelter at 1 o'clock. So that phase had been complete, which was to shut off the meters and to restore electricity. Talking specifically about the shelter, it was opened in the early evening of September 13th. It operated through September 16th. The emergency management folks, along with several of the selectmen and others, were there to support that. It was a tremendous outpouring. Really helped families at a time that they really needed it. The food and other donations were extraordinary. It was truly an example of residents coming together. It was a pretty dramatic effort that I think Mr. Valancourt can speak to, of trying to get what was left over and bring it to food shelters and food pantries in Lawrence to make sure that the food that had been donated would help others as well. The next phase was, so a phase was sort of missing in these slides, but to understand, once the gas was shut off and the electricity was returned, that's when we determined through call. So a call was made to tell folks, if you had shut off your gas as a precaution and want to get it back on, we need to work with Columbia Gas to coordinate a response to do that. I think if you had asked me at the time how many people as a precaution shut off the gas, if 1,517 were impacted and couldn't get them turned back on, I would have thought a couple of hundred. Turned out to be 2,500. And so, again, trying to remobilize the Columbia Gas crowd and get them out to turn on those 2,500 meters took a while. Took a couple of days. I think the response was reasonable, but it took a couple of days to get everybody back up and running. So everybody who was no longer in an impacted area had gas within 2 days of that Sunday, I think somewhere in the Tuesday morning realm. That sort of completed that phase of things. We had begun to think about claims, how folks would file claims. Columbia Gas was working on the process to manage claims. We in North Andover made a conscious decision to set up a center which we thought would be both a claims and resource center to provide more than just claims information to residents if they needed it, other kinds of resources. We worked with the Greater Lawrence Community Action Council to deal with housing-related concerns. We were dealing with the Mass Division of Insurance to have people come in to be able to answer questions about property insurance. We've had a staff member there each day to answer, a senior staff member answering questions. I think Chris McClure has pretty much lived there to make sure that they had the information technology they need. Remember, this was an empty storefront. The Messinas have been fantastic. They've, in essence, donated the storefront to us. It's nearly 6,000 square feet. It logistically processes to date over 1,400 claims. It's done so in a way that I think is respectful and efficient. They have 10 full-time claims reps along with management and a lot of other resources. So as you can imagine, setting up overnight, in essence, a claim center. Mrs. Santilli was a great help as well. Getting that center up and running, getting the logistics done, making sure it was all set up the way they needed. And by the way, creating up a sort of wireless network to make sure that these folks can process claims wirelessly, providing a public Wi-Fi network. All that stuff was done. Showed the sort of professionalism and expertise of our staff in about 24 hours. And that opened at noon on Wednesday of last week. Again, through Saturday, had processed somewhere around 1,400 claims. We're using that location as shown up here to also provide the response as relates to the hot plates. It's where folks can pick them up. We had an original allotment of hot plates, I think 300. We got a second allotment of close to 700 to supplement that. And we got through the 300 and a couple more after that. And beginning tomorrow, when that claim center reopens, they'll begin to distribute the hot plates that people have requested. So again, at that claim center, it's the place for residents to go if they have a claim. It operates Tuesday through Saturday, gives people an opportunity to know where to go. We have a direct space heater number. So the second phase of this sort of response phase to help folks through the transitional period was to also afford them space heaters. This is a 1-800 number on this screen, and we'll put it on the town's website. You can call that number. They will come with a licensed electrician, make sure that your home can handle the load of the space heater. They'll also install a smoke and carbon monoxide detector, something that Chief McCarthy and his fellow chiefs in the region are required. The hot plates come with a series of safety instructions, which again were developed with the help of the fire chiefs to make sure that it's appropriate. And so there's a 1-800 number that folks can call to do that. The next phase, so this is the one-pager, and again, all this stuff is on the town's website, and we're going to talk about communication at the end of this, but this is where residents have been going. We understand that they can continue in this location for the foreseeable future. We have not placed an end date on this claim center, and it became more important as we were able to, on late Saturday, get Columbia Gas to articulate more clearly as to what they would reimburse. The conversion to an alternative fuel, as an example, was something that came up on Saturday. So the restoration process, since there was a state of emergency identified by the governor, he was able to place someone in charge other than Columbia. Eversource had completed its sort of logistical pieces as it relates to the shutoffs. It made some sense to bring in someone who had an understanding of large-scale construction processes. He tapped Navy Captain retired Joe Albanese, who's also the founder and CEO of Commodore Builders, which is a construction management company. He was identified as the Chief Recovery Officer. He will be coordinating more than 1,000 staff in various areas of making this restoration process happen. I think what we got from Friday was this. If you're in the impacted area, although there'll be creative ways to try to reduce those folks impacted, the assumption you have to make is that you will not have gas through November 19th. That was what was said Friday, and we continue to repeat those dates. Everybody hopes and believes it can be earlier, but I think from the beginning what we've tried to do is identify or get the Columbia Gas and others to identify what that window would be so that people can start to prepare accordingly. The restoration process started today. There was some Columbia Gas crews in the town. There'll be a ramping up of the number of Columbia Gas crews in the community. Every one of the low-pressure services has to be replaced. In some cases, that won't mean digging up the existing low-pressure service. They may sleeve a high-pressure service through it. So there are several different ways to accomplish this. In some cases, working with our engineering staff, Jim Stanford from DPW, and the two other DPW directors from the other impacted communities, and engineering staff and the folks that are being headed up by Mr. Albanese, we found locations where high-pressure main has been installed or is proximate to low-pressure main in areas where we can connect over to the high-pressure main rather than having to dig up the whole line, making the restoration for certain people in certain neighborhoods and certain assets go quicker. A good example of that is the ongoing work on Route 125 near Shadi's that hopefully will bring up that strip mall, the DPW facility, an auto body placed in that area that may allow us a short-term win other than waiting for November 19th. So you need to know that our engineering staff is aggressively working with the parties here to find creative ways using other high-pressure infrastructure in the town to get some people up sooner. It will not impact everybody. It's not going to make November 19th become, October 1st for many people. But we are working on those kinds of creative solutions with the Columbia Gas folks and the Chief Restoration Recovery Officer. Another example, so you know, is that working with almost everybody in the staff here, we've listed a series of high-priority assets, including Foles Terrace and Bingham Way, two of our senior housing facilities, to find ways to bring those facilities on sooner. We've provided that list to Columbia Gas and Joe Albanese. They're working to see if there are high-pressure mains in the area. We think that's also a possible early win to try to address the impact on some of our housing authorities. One of the restoration phases, in addition to this construction phase, Abdu should know by form of statistic, there are 48 miles of main that need to be replaced, either sleeved and replaced or dug up and replaced. If you do that in the form of linear feet, it's something north of 300,000 linear feet of pipe. And in the end, as they start to ramp up this substantial construction and assessment phase, there'll be a total of 195 crews stationed between the three communities. We don't have, on a busy gas replacement day, which we've had some, we don't have more than a half a dozen crews. I would say more like 3 or 4. And so in North Andover, you will see a couple dozen crews at a time, and there will be impact in the entire region as it relates to traffic and other related items as they do some of this work, and we've made people aware of that. We have, with agreement by all of the parties, hired our own project manager, owner's project manager. It's the same company between all three communities. They'll have a point of contact that'll work with the engineering staff of each of the communities to make sure that in addition to Mr. Albanese's staff as recovery officer, overseeing the work of whoever the contractors are doing the gas main replacement, we'll have our own eyes and ears there to make sure that we can provide the kind of feedback and we can add sort of another layer of trust to the process. And so that has happened. The communities have coordinated together to issue one procurement to do that. And there'll be a single person working for one engineering firm. We'll have staff at each of these individual sites reporting back and then reporting back to our engineering staff to make sure that all of that work is happening efficiently. Teams of approximately 4 will begin assessments of each and every property. Some calls went out today. I know some residents have received those calls. Those calls will again begin to ramp up. Every resident in the impacted area will be contacted to schedule a visit of what I'm calling an assessment team, licensed electrician, licensed plumber, a gas technician, and they will go through the house and in some cases spend several hours evaluating the infrastructure in the home, the appliances, heating system, and all the rest of the information. In the end, all of the gas work needs to be done and all of the assessments need to be done, other than in these cases where there's more creative alternatives to get to this November 19th date. So you can imagine how many crews, if you just simply do the math of 8,600 meters divided by 4 people, divided by the number of days to get this done, how many crews it's going to take to get all of this done. And that's why there was an employment center that was set up, and there's a significant amount of ramping up to get all of the staff in place to do this kind of work. I think they're going to need north of 300 Massachusetts licensed plumbers. And they're working toward that, and they've have commitments from numbers that are approaching that. So this process will ramp up over time. We've given you the general restoration timeline. About that, 24th was the construction teams. There's a venting process beginning tomorrow in several neighborhoods in North Andover. We've put something out through our news to folks about that. There might be a minor smell of gas. It's a safe process, but we've published that on the town's website so you know where that's going to be. That's the first part of then beginning the replacement process. We'll continue to communicate that. Talked about the assessments. The ongoing effort to locate creative, efficient restorations are the ones that we've talked about, like the Housing Authority and like on 125. We'll continue to work with them. We think there's some Main Street options where there was some high-pressure main already installed. We think there's some options along Mass Ave as well. So we'll continue to have our engineering staff work with the recovery team's engineering staff to find creative solutions to bring some people on sooner. Communication, sorry for this slide is a little small. The amount of communication has been multifaceted, dynamic, and at times fantastic, and at times probably folks not feel not so fantastic. But I think we've attempted to really broaden the method of communication to recognize that people communicate in many different platforms to get their information. The town's website has been one point. It should be noted that at 6:19 of the night of the event, with Mr. McClure's help, we established a hashtag MV Gas Fire banner right center in the town's website. It was at 6:19 of the night of the event. Since that night, there's now a direct link to that, which is listed above. If you click on that link, you'll get to that banner. It literally provides a communication by communication timeline of everything that's been communicated by the town since 6:19 on September 3rd. There's been 85 posts to that. Everything we can, from claims information to everything that was going on at the time. So you see the most recent post, and you can click on the history and go all the way back to September 13th. The Smart 911 system was used. The first Smart Alert was made at 6:02 p.m. the night of the event. It targeted 8,927 users. There's been 9 alerts since that time. The last group targeted 9,864. The reason for the increase, of course, is we are seeing a dramatic increase in people's interest to participate. We've seen that on Twitter and Facebook, the Smart 911, and every form we have, folks are signing up to get information. And so, which is great, and it's positive for us that people are using these resources to communicate. There have been 41 email updates for those folks who if we put out an email or signed up to get the email, and there are, I think we're over 1,400 folks who now get those email updates. There have been 14,590 preloaded landlines in the system. So in addition to these sort of targeted lines, we do have 14,590 preloaded telephone numbers that every time we issue a robocall, those folks get a call. On the Twitter side, on both my Twitter and the town's Twitter, we've tweeted at least 100 times regarding the incident. We've seen an increase of more than 1,300 Twitter followers, I think. Split about evenly. My Twitter account has gone up by about 650 in the town. Similarly, between the two, there's now more than 6,000 people following the two accounts on Twitter, and that doesn't account for about 7,000 people following the police department on Twitter. To date, we've had more than 24 press conferences or interviews to try to communicate information to the public and media. Facebook has seen an increase of 685 followers with the help of some volunteers, and again, the selectmen's help. There was a door-to-door distribution yesterday of the hard copy of the claims information. It didn't reach everybody, but I think it was certainly a solid attempt to get out there. And we've done the same thing at the library and the claim center. There's also additional forms downstairs here at Town Hall and in other venues, and of course, Kim has been, alongside us all the way, making sure that there are the kinds of communications that we'd expect to the public. I should also note, a couple of things. One is that, having identified some of the staff, Gene Enright is working with the 2 economic developments from the other 2 communities. There's some conversation right now through MEBAN of bringing the Small Business Association. We're working with them on that. I can tell you that we have, at this point, the fewest businesses impacted of any of the 3 communities. As of about 7 o'clock when I asked the folks out back, I think we're down to 4 or 5 remaining restaurants that are not open. And it sounds like we're within a reasonable time frame of trying to get those folks back up, which is really positive. In some cases, using Andover specifically, when Main Street was impacted, I think they lost north of 60 businesses at the time. And so everybody was impacted in a slightly different way. Although it was a regional event, each community sort of had its own persona in terms of how it was impacted, and we're working around that. So although we've worked collectively to try to bring regional resources to this kind of problem, each of myself, the town manager in Andover, and the mayor of Lawrence have recognized that each of our communities were impacted differently, and the response needed to be nuanced to reflect that. One other person who has been sort of nonstop in his way to help businesses to be creative, to find solutions, and has been an extraordinary asset is Paul Hutchinson, who's here, a building inspector, sorry, Hutchins. And he has been, I'm not sure he's gone home, but that's okay. We like him anyway, and he's been around. He identified an early problem that was brought back to the group, to the command staff, about the possibility of an impact on boilers in the long term. He's been a great resource through that, and certainly the PD, which I'm sure I'm leaving folks out, but Chuck Ray was driving me around 5 minutes into the event and has been omnipresent in many, many ways. So all of these folks have had an influence on making sure that our response is thorough and we continue to try to find ways to do that and serve residents. We do know it's a long haul. We continue to try to push the state and Columbia Gas to find ways to bring gas service on sooner. But we want to set realistic expectations as well so people can begin to prepare. So with that, here's some additional websites that folks can contact. There's some unemployment benefit options, and Mass Revenue Assistance is also helping taxpayers. I would note at the bottom there that the YMCA was an early return to service and communicated with us very early on that they would allow residents of North Andover, members or not, to go to the North Andover Y, which is a fantastic facility, the Andover North Andover Y, use the showers, use the workout facilities, use the free Wi-Fi. They're a fantastic partner and continue to be, and we know that it's an important resource. So with that, I'll answer any questions you may have.
I had one question, and maybe it answers itself. It's probably actually more for Paul, who is in the back of the room. So when they're assessing the houses that are down, for lack of a better word, do they have to be somewhat functional? Because I guess you're inspecting for appliances and things like that, but if the house is shuttered, and there's a few, mine included, would you still need to go in to see if, like, your gas stove is still functional? Or will that come when the house comes back for its final inspection to be?
That'll come as being rebuilt.
Okay. And then,
Wait, can I just clarify that? The teams of 4 that are coming through to inspect to see what's the situation in the house that's happening in the next, 3 weeks, they're not going to be able to...
It's longer than 3 weeks.
Well, right, sorry.
Just want to be clear, yeah.
That's happening before the November 19th date. They can't check a gas stove, for example, because there's no gas coming to the stove, so they can't assess it, or
The
can
question
they?
was specific to houses that were impacted, for instance, by fire or the boilers. So let's call those the 32, of which it was, of that 8, which were seriously impacted, including Mrs. Vidali's. That's a completely separate animal than everybody else.
But so the other impacted homes
Yeah,
that
they're
were
gonna
not
check that.
damaged by fire, they'll be able to check those stoves,
Yes.
even though there's no gas to the stove?
They're going to check the stoves, they're going to check all gas appliances, dryers, stoves.
Okay.
What else am I missing? Dryers, stoves, water heater, hot water heaters only. One thing I didn't identify, and I apologize, and I knew I would do it from the beginning. Brian LaGrasse is here from the health department. They went business by business and asked what the businesses needed. I think it was a big help in identifying, one, giving businesses a, comfortable sense that people were thinking about their particular needs. Not every business, but certain kinds of businesses that the health department directly gets involved in. As a function of that, we're able to identify some of the solutions which could be provided to get people up and running. So they were a fantastic business asset early on in the problem and continue to be, to make sure we can get those businesses up and running.
the other question that I had, and so a lot of the families, a lot of the residents in town do get the robocalls. But if you would like them also to their homes, if you would like them also to your cell phone, what is the means to sign them up for that?
Yeah, the town's website is the best route, and we had switched from one system to the other around July 1, and we put out about a dozen push notices to folks and news to get people switched. But obviously, that's always a little slow. So they get onto the town's website, they can sign up very easily, they can put multiple numbers in they want, multiple email addresses, so that's the best way to do it. We have seen a dramatic climb in that, obviously during this event by more than 1,000, but if folks want to do that and they're not currently getting it, they just go on the town's website. That's the best way to do it.
Okay. Yeah, probably everybody should put
Yes, sure.
as much contact as possible, if they're at work and they don't know what's going on.
It costs us no more effort to communicate to one person than 100,000. And so I agree. If there are multiple means of communication you're comfortable with, and the system we switched to is far more dynamic in terms of its ability to communicate to residents. So I would encourage you to put multiple numbers and multiple forms of contact.
That's-
I know it could be a little annoying if you get 3 or 4 items, but
Everything's dinging at once.
everything, and it does happen. But at least it provides the residents an opportunity to be aware of what's going on.
I just have to make this comment for what sometimes some people think is the robocalls on town business is a little bit of a nuisance. Boy, you wouldn't say that anymore. So it's been a real asset.
Do we have off of that? Like at our senior center, for instance, I know that I got a lot of contact from people who weren't online following Twitter and Facebook. but a lot of our seniors at our center do have cell phones. And so do we have a resource down there to help sign up as many of those members as possible in the system so that their cell phones are on that
Yep.
list as well? I think a lot of them probably have landlines, but just making sure that they
Sure.
go and update their profiles on the Rave system so their cell phone number gets the text alerts.
I know that there's been training for all the people, the major staff members in terms of how to do that, but we can just reemphasize to make sure that the staff members down there know how folks can sign up. Yep, not a problem at all.
So I just wanted to say, I don't think we can understate enough, or overstate enough the mutual aid that we received from fire and police. I think the North Andover Fire Department put a graphic out of the number of fire departments in the area that responded. And having had an opportunity to go over to the command center and seeing the number of first responders that were there and the coordination and the logistics behind that was just amazing. How, they just had everything clicking over there in such a short period of time. It was just, I don't know if you have a number of police and fire that actual first responders, but it was unbelievable and very impressive to see how well coordinated that was and how everybody was working together. Also, the town staff, did unbelievable job keeping people informed, trying to keep people safe. Volunteers at the shelter. We had people that were just going home from work. And this one woman was a licensed nurse. She lived in Haverhill. She was going home from work. She heard about it. She came to the shelter. She stayed all night helping the elderly and helping people coming in. So we had unbelievable numbers of volunteers. And there were other people like that, too, that were just driving by. And actually, some people that were there that were being sheltered stepped up and started helping people and stayed all weekend to help people. So it was amazing, the volunteers. And then the generosity of the residents and the businesses in the area. We, again, at that shelter, we had businesses coming in with food and coffee and everything for the clothing for the people there, and as well as residents, too, just coming by with all kinds. So really, it was an amazing response by people, and just really, great to see that. So.
I would like to just add, are you finished? We're going to have something else? Just to add to that, I don't really cry, but this makes me emotional to see the fire department from all these different communities running into my house as they're adding a new pack because they only could stay in for 10 minutes because the heat in my basement, and the kindness and the effort that they put in from all over. I mean, we had Haverhill, Essex, Londonderry, York, Boxford, Topsfield, and the kindness and compassion that they showed, and they were exhausted just watching them, and when they finally put it out, just the sense of pride that they did it. So I cannot thank them enough. And of course, everybody has heard that I have 3 heroes, 2 11-year-old boys that saw the fire in my house and told their parents. And they probably saved my house and my pets. And of course, Chief Gray literally went in and grabbed my pets. The bird, I just found out, was on the bottom of the cage with the wings spread out. We have a little parakeet that was my son's. And even that meant a lot to us because he talks and he's quite entertaining, and we really love him at our house. But I know it's kind of funny, but it was, and the chief went in, flew in, got the animals, and back in the car, and was saving people's lives, getting people. I just, it's amazing to have seen it. So you should be very proud of your departments, both chiefs, because I'm really proud of them both, and the ones that came and just kept going back in and working to help their neighbors in need. So, and I missed some of the great things that you just told me. I didn't know all about the shelter. I was not available for that, but
Great to see people coming in.
yeah.
Even the first responders were coming in, and so it was amazing.
And the backup with the rest of our staff, the Board of Health, our building department, you could go on for hours, and thank you very much. That's all I can say. My family thanks you, and I know a lot of other families do as well.
Good job, guys.
Good job.
Maybe bring it down a little bit. A question about Columbia Gas and their response. I mean, what I'm seeing and hearing a lot of is that their response has been less than optimal for timeframes that they're giving people, and some of the definitions, like around reasonable costs and things like that, about what they're going to replace. I mean, do we see anything where they're bringing on additional resources that they maybe can get people at least comfortable and ensure that, we're going to get some, well, not we, I'm not affected, but some people, they're going to get reimbursements for some of these conversions they're going to do. I know they've said that, but they've always got that reasonable cost clause in there. And do you think we'll get some more definition and some further information of that, and maybe some better response time, too, for some of the folks that, when they're saying 72 hours, some people are saying, oh, that's too long. I need to know now, because I need to start making plans.
What was it, 72 hours?
I've been hearing and seeing things where people have been saying that the Columbia Gas will get back to them in 72 hours.
Yeah. How do I answer that? I think that the problem was caused by Columbia Gas. Right? Everything we're talking about tonight is sort of our reaction collectively to an event that was not caused by us, but we're trying to assist. I think that with the declaration of a state of emergency on Friday, things improved from where they were overnight Thursday. And for those folks, several of which are in the room, overnight Thursday was not, didn't make us feel comfortable. I think things have gotten a little better over time, and I think the governor's decision to place someone in charge as part of the declaration of emergency overseeing the response operation helps. We sit in those rooms, we listen to what's going on, and we see change in a way that's positive. I think the single page that was placed on the town's website Saturday about what they will cover was a dramatic change, because up to that point, they didn't talk about anything about conversion. They weren't responding to it. And I think that sheet is about as clear as you're going to get. And I think it's, in fairness, it's reasonable in the sense that I would expect any entity who's standing out insurance claims to use the term reasonable. It's one of those terms you'll use. We'll continue to push them to make sure reasonable errs on the side of the customer. And that's what we feel like is part of our role as they go through the claims process. So we get mixed sentiment back on that. I think I think the resources have improved. A lot of the resources in terms of getting in people's homes and doing the work. Those will mostly be contract labor. Columbia Gas does not replace the lines in the street. Columbia Gas contractors replace the line in the street. So we're seeing a different group of people with substantial construction experience overseeing the work that's going to happen on the roadway. The same group responsible for getting the assets, like hiring plumbers and electricians. So do I think it's going to be perfect? No. Do I think that it's better today than yesterday, and better yesterday than the day before? I do. And if there are individual cases where what the Columbia Gas is saying is unreasonable, then I think we'll continue to push to advocate for our residents to make sure that the response is appropriate. I don't know about the 72 hours. I know that people going through the claim center are filling out documents. I think in some cases the response could be that, given the sort of workload of what's going on. But I do feel every day that the number of assets committed to this restoration process are dramatically increasing, and that will probably peak out about mid-October. I think folks will see a more and more an improved response to that, because the staffing is being increased every day to address the questions that you have.
Okay.
Yep, and I didn't, because I knew I was going to miss folks. Steve Foster has been intimately involved in making sure that all of our schools were safe, spent an extraordinary amount of time Saturdays and Sunday making sure that he looked at every building with the appropriate people before we sent kids back to school, which we know for parents, you can imagine sending them back into an area where some homes were impacted. So I want to recognize Stevie continues to work sort of in that regard to make sure that our schools and our public buildings are safe as well.
You worked really hard, I think, at channeling the town's energy and interest in getting Columbia Gas and the administration to prioritize reimbursing people who are looking to get the electric hot water heaters at their home, so that way they don't go 8 weeks without hot water. In fairness, what can we do? What more can we do as a board? What more can we do as a town? What more can we do with this administration at the state level to work with lower income residents who don't have the capital already in hand to retrofit and wait for reimbursement?
So it's a really good question. It was raised by Chief McCarthy today. Of course, I haven't recognized yet because he popped in from yet another problem that he was great, responded to. The fire department was fantastic, as Rosemary identified, and continues to be in terms of their investment in making sure that this phase is safe too. because I think people need to know that. We're looking into ways to address that. I guess the phrase is maybe inappropriate, spitballing a little bit. I've reached out to a couple of local banks. They're under some limitations because of the equity clause associated with giving loans. I've reached out to the Commonwealth to see if we can do things in municipal government to extend that option to residents. I'm waiting for some responses on that. It's a little creative, this idea that we become sort of the lender. We're looking at those kind of options. I'm working with Mass Emergency Management to see if they can provide some authorization to do that kind of thing. So something like someone has an interest to convert to electric, let's say, I'm picking a number, say a reasonable cost, whatever that is $2,000. I've heard varying numbers, a lot of which are below $2,000, quite frankly. I'm separating boilers because I don't think you're going to get the same response on boilers, but let's talk about hot water. And something where someone could get a no-interest loan for 2 months, bring in a bill and say, it's going to be $1,500, here it is from the plumber, and get a loan, be able to pay the person off so that they don't have to come out of pocket. And then when the reimbursement, then they process a claim for the reimbursement and somehow making that all work. So we are working that channel right now, like we did on the channel that expanded the claims for residents. We're working that channel to try to find creative ways to bridge the gap for those folks who, taking $2,000 out of pocket, $1,500 out of pocket may be challenging. So we're continuing to work that piece of things. I think I've been able to narrow down those entities that can help. And hopefully in the next couple of days, we can roll out some kind of program that would do that.
I think it's important. I think you recognize the need, but so the town has been coordinating with the schools and the youth center. We've been collecting gift cards, mostly for food-related purchases, funneling them to St. Michael's Church, where they've been handing them out to families that sign up in need from North Andover. And within 70 minutes, they handed out all the gift cards to 39 families. And if families are struggling, and this is a struggling time, if they're struggling to the point that they need small gift cards, that's why they're there. It's just the $1,200, $1,500 purchase. I mean, surely it's really easy for Columbia Gas and the powers that be at the state level to see why this is such an urgent need in all three communities.
We agree. I mean, in a world where North Andover is not part of a broader sort of government structure, I think we'd all agree tonight that we would spend the money and forward it to our residents and cover the cost, and even placing it as a sort of a lien off a tax bill. It could be deducted from a tax. I could get real creative, it shows up in your tax bill and then it's tax deductible from a tax basis. We don't possess some of that authority, although it'd be neat to do. But we're aware of the issue. We're working with the players we think that can maybe get that creative with us so that we can respond in a way that helps our residents.
And so right now, Columbia Gas is going to be following up with people who have submitted claims to follow up and close that loop, right? And so we've said there are 1,400 claims that have already been processed since it's been open, but there are over 1,500 homes that were impacted.
I think the home count might be lower than that because the meters, it might be, 2 meters on one property. So I think we're about even with give or take with the number of homes in town.
But certainly there were people who lost power that have gas still. They weren't in the impacted area that have
Correct.
gone and just processed
Yes.
their small claims. And
Yeah.
so are there any more ways that we're looking at getting this information out to just residents in general in the impacted area? Because clearly we're missing a chunk that you would think would have wanted to but quickly get this.
We're open to different means. Again, we're using, it's a multiple platform approach. Some of it is sort of certainly electronic, but dropping off the flyers as well. Again, cell phones, email, social media. We've been on, radio, we've been on television, we'll continue to communicate that. I think if we track at the consistent pace we are, so I'm not seeing, it wasn't as if it was, sort of 3, 100, 100. It's been pretty uniform. So we'll look to see what happens through next week. If it continues at the sort of 300 folks or so a day, then that tells us we're going to reach a pretty aggressive saturation point to most of the folks. And then as the calls go out individually to residents for those assessments, I think it's what we're going to want to make sure the assessment team has is that single page what they'll cover. So when you go to do the assessment, in addition to probably getting approval that day that your gas dryer and your gas stove are being replaced, here are the other things that we'd cover for. That'll get that form to each of the homes that are impacted as well.
Okay.
So sort of hand delivery, right?
Yeah, well,
Which would be good.
yeah, the multi-pronged approach.
Can I just follow up on the St. Michael's, just to make it clear that it's non-denominational, is they're collecting the money.
Absolutely, yes.
It's not just for St. Michael's parishioners, and it's not necessarily even just for North Andover-ites. They made that pretty clear on Sunday. They did take a second collection to contribute to it, but it is for anybody in need. So I just wanted to make that clear.
So just a brief to that. So there was the Greater Lawrence Disaster Relief Fund was created. It's part of the ECCF. It's its own sort of bank account and process, sort of outside of the conversation of our response to date. That fund will have north of $10 million in it. I would expect that we've been working aggressively to develop a fair and easy intake process that'll affect every one of the sort of meters impacted, every one of the residents. And there'll be a process, rolled out, we think, as early as later this week, where folks could be able to file a claim against that fund to give them some additional monetary relief. The specifics haven't been rolled out yet, but I think it'll be sort of a monetary response to every one of those folks. We'd expect the Greater Lawrence Disaster Relief Fund representative trained to manage the intake process will also be placed at our resource center. It's part of the reason we're calling it a claims and resource center, because we'd like to see folks go to one location and not have to go to various locations. So we're hoping to have more information on that later in the week.
I think a point of clarification, there was a flyer that went home to the schools suggesting that if parents in the schools wanted to help North Andover kids impacted by this, they could send in gift cards at certain locations, that St. Michael's would distribute those. So I think those gift cards were intended for North Andover families. Probably the second collection and other things are
exactly. I think
more
the second
broadly,
collection
for
was-
anyone,
yeah.
but
But it
just to
was-
clarify that, in case people got that communication from the schools. Are you done with your questions?
Yeah.
I had a question about what we're doing and what the state is doing to ensure that the restoration work is being done in a safe manner, and that that's not, public safety isn't being compromised in an effort to restore all the pipe as quickly as possible. I know that's a concern I'm hearing from residents, and it's obviously an aggressive timeline. So can you share a little bit about what is being put in place to ensure
Yeah,
that
it's a great
that's-
question. It's been raised in a number of different platforms. There's been newspaper articles about it. I think what took one of the more difficult challenges, and this is not in any way rival the challenges facing our families, but from those folks here working to try to give more information to the residents, one of the real challenges was sort of gap between Sunday when PARA came on and Friday when the plan was revealed, because folks kept on saying, what's the plan, what's the plan, what's the plan? And that period was really about making sure that what was going to be proposed could be delivered, right? Sitting in those meetings. Don't overpromise, however bad it is, promise what you can deliver on, big issue. And make sure that you have the safety integrated into the plan to make sure that folks feel comfortable about the process. And I can tell you that's part of the reason why it seemed like those 4 days seemed sort of long. I know they seem long to the residents, given the feedback I received about those kind of things. Having been involved in those daily conversations now with the folks that are participating and overseeing this process, would make people comfortable, should make people comfortable. The resources included, the oversight, our redundant oversight by putting an OPM on top of the OPM that's going to be managed in the project. Those kinds of folks will not just be, there'll be contractors working in the street, but there'll be zone commanders who are not Columbia Gas people overseeing the work in the 8 zones. There'll be additional engineering staff. We've implemented engineering staff over that for the very purpose of making sure that what goes in and what gets done is safe. And so it doesn't seem like, it did seem like a long time at the time, but those days were really spent asking those questions repeatedly to make sure that the plan got rolled out was a safe plan. And again, that includes the kinds of sort of belts and suspenders to make sure the professional staff is overseeing the construction projects, and that the adequate crews are there to install it within the timeline provided. not just putting out a date and rushing through work, but they're talking about adding 195 crews at the peak of this. Again, I can't give you a magnitude of that. You have not seen 195 work crews probably in aggregate over a 3-year period in North Andover. And they're talking about 195 crews working within the geographic area. You know, the geographic area in North Andover, Andover, and Lawrence, if you put a circle just around that area, it's not very large. We have fairly large geographic communities, but if you took South Lawrence at 3 square miles, our impacted area is probably a little less than that, and Andover's at 3 square miles. Putting 195 crews in 11 square miles, that's why I start telling people, be careful of traffic. You're going to get a lot of traffic, and we're working with them to make sure we don't disrupt school and drop-off, because the magnitude of the staff to get it done in a safe way will be substantial, and the oversight of those crews will be substantial. So I feel comfortable that all those questions were answered, and the plan was not rolled out till they could be addressed.
I have to tell you, it was extremely noticeable to see in the streets of North Andover all the gas professionals from all over. In my area in particular, they were from Indiana. And I don't want to give people just real excitement or false hope. They were not reinstalling people. They were marking the gas lines. I asked them, and that's what they were doing, but they came from Indiana. So when you see them, please thank those out-of-towners that came to help us out. It was like it seemed like it was almost on every street. So it was really, it was pretty comforting to say, wow, you know, they're really getting in there and working hard to fix this as quickly as possible. So, but doesn't mean you're all getting your gas tomorrow. It means that they're getting ready.
My last question is more just a thing to put on the board to discuss at a later point, as I'm sure you don't have the numbers now, but it will be, I guess, an action to look at what's the cost impact of this to us as a town in terms of all the overtime and resources expended.
A good segue.
I assume you don't have it.
I do not have that because it's evolving. Lynn Savage, of course, as our finance director, is the person responsible for coordinating, making sure each of the departments are tracking costs accordingly, and she's the right person to be in charge of that, and we will make sure that we continue to track costs. Again, this was a Columbia Gas event. This was not a Town of North Andover event. It affected our residents, and it affected what we do on a daily basis, and will continue, quite frankly, to affect on what we do for the next 8 weeks or so. We do not expect to come out of this having incurred one nickel beyond what we would have if we were doing something else. So
Great.
we're going to track it, and we're going to push to make sure that that's the case.
Wonderful. Any final questions? I think-
Yes, please.
Sorry.
Well, that's
Why
a
I was
great
thinking
thing.
you had already gone.
No, that's a great thing about having a team. Everybody brings their own perspective. But collectively, I think we've expressed our gratitude. It's awesome. The sense from the community, very powerful. The one thing that occurs to me as you were explaining about the process with this all, and it is something that you in particular, I think, command, and that is you call the belts and suspenders, the backup, the contingency plans. The one thing I haven't heard anybody talk about with this, which is what happens when there's a disagreement? What happens when Columbia Gas says, this is what we say is reasonable, and the consumer, our fellow townsfolk say, that's not what it cost, or I don't think that's reasonable. Has there been thought about what that process will be, and how would that be mediated, arbitrated? Because from a practical standpoint, if you have 1,500 people who have a problem to be solved, they're going to be on a continuum of very satisfied to unsatisfied, and hopefully most everybody's in the middle. But what's the thought process behind that?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too technical, but I would say this, that there are folks who very few folks, let me say the response.
I'm sorry, I
We're
smell
smell
gas.
gas.
I'm just really paranoid now.
Yeah, all of a sudden.
Yes.
It's probably venting. You want to check, see what's going on? It's always great to have your facility director at a meeting. Never know.
And our fire chief.
We're right on it.
Sorry.
It was just instant, though.
Yes.
Yeah, like you said.
If you hear a pop, run out.
It's a little late for the venting, but it could be. So
That's a guess, he did.
try to answer that while folks are a little distracted.
No, I appreciate
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
See, I didn't have an answer, so we distracted folks a little bit. So I would say this, so that there is a real benefit in the way the process has evolved to date. And what I mean by that is the fact that the town manager in Andover and the mayor of Lawrence, they're supporting political groups, your folks, and the board in Andover and the council in Lawrence, the governor's office, and all of the staff. There is a real benefit for us continuing to work together. And the benefit is, in the end, is to leverage solutions when there are complications. Some of these conversations have not yielded the outcomes we want. And yet I think we're in an okay space now. It's like the Saturday, here's what we're covering, which was a lot of those folks in the room. So what I guess I'm saying is, as we stay united with a group of 3 communities and the governor's office and all these other folks that are here, federal folks and state folks, that coalition provides the strength to solve the kinds of problems that we do think eventually will arise.
That's what I expect. Seems like a harsh word, but that's what you've proven so far, and I think it's working very well. I do think that's in the back of people's heads in terms of, because there's an element of trust that is now required in terms of following through
Sure.
as promised. So wherever that can be in the discussions collectively, I guess I'm just advocating for that in preparation. Hopefully, we won't have to apply it, but just kind of knowing human nature and the challenges, being prepared.
And I think there'll be a point in which some of that stuff can be resolved through negotiation and leverage and goodwill, and there'll be some of those things that end up in places where I don't visit, courtrooms.
Yep, understand.
But we'll try to manage through the ones that affect our residents the most.
And thank you again
Great.
for all you've done.
All good?
As I was just going to close this discussion, if we're done with all of our questions, there's been a lot of gratitude expressed to our first responders and all the different department heads and volunteers and so many people who have worked tirelessly on this, but I think it's appropriate to close with a humongous thank you to you, our town manager, for your absolute, unwavering dedication to North Andover, spending literally 24 hours a day, it feels like, here since this has happened, and you've been extraordinary, so thank you very much for the service. And your leadership. Yes, your leadership,
Might have to get
absolutely.
you a sweater like the blizzard of '78, the famous sweater, but it was a little warm.
I don't know if residents have some questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, yes, residents' questions.
Donald Stewart, 52 Prospect Street. 2 months shy of my 78th birthday. I am so proud of this town as a townie. For the first responders, police, fire, Jeff Coco and his crew. Even today, the town hall, people are answering phones, trying to help people out. It's not their job. Wait till you get Mr. Maylor's overtime bill. You'll be all set,
He wishes.
Yeah, but I want to thank everybody for it, and the first responders. I think it makes you proud to live in this town. And Mr. Chairman, could I have one leeway on a comment, please? Sure. Ray, when's your last day? Friday. A quick little story, okay? 20-odd years ago, Mark Reeves was the town manager, and Mr. Santilli came for his job. I gave you 20. I give you. Seems like 20. Okay. And what happened was, Bill Duffy decided he wanted to go interview Mr. Santilli. So as usual, we go down to interview him, and of course, Bill does all the talking because I don't say anything. I just sit there and I just look at him. And what happens is we leave the meeting for 5 minutes, right? 10 minutes. And Bill Duffy says to me, he says, "What'd you think?" I paused a minute. I says, "He's going to be a pain in the ass." Ray, you've come full circle. And I'll still bring you donuts. And I ain't going to stick around for that gas smell. Sorry, I'm leaving.
Thank you. Any other?
Actually, I have a question.
Yes.
I didn't intend to have a question, but I actually do after I heard everything. So Anna Choi, 70 Maple Avenue. So just because, there's always full disclosure and everyone's trying to get as much information as you can, is there any way that the residents who do intend to convert to propane or get an electric water heater can have a list of available people to do that? Because I think I personally don't have to, but I know people who intend to do that. And it would be nice if they're not competing with the same 5 plumbers or the same 10 regional, companies that do that, because they may have the money, they may even borrow the money from the town, and with the money in hand, they don't have the people to come into their homes to do it because there's not that many. So if there's a list of, Merrimack Valley plumbers, Merrimack Valley electricians, or whatever, for townspeople to access so that they can have the people come in to do that to their homes. So that's just a question whether you could do that and have that available.
Great question. Appreciate it. So there's certain things we don't do, and one of those is to identify vendors. But with your suggestion, I can talk to the Merchants Association and the Merrimack Valley Chamber of Commerce and have them list people in their groups who are licensed in either plumbing or electrician. We can't do that because we can't look as if we're influencing who gets work. But we can try to do that with those 2 groups. NAMS probably has a group of electricians, have them put them on their website. And direct people to those websites if they're looking for folks.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good
Or
question.
maybe even do like an all hands on deck, even beyond Merrimack Valley.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can't center that.
Or they could.
They could, right.
Right.
So, but I will communicate with them about doing that.
Okay,
That's
okay.
great. It's great, because there will be a real challenge. If you can imagine, this process requires several hundred electricians and plumbers.
Right.
It's going to be a real challenge for residents to compete for those same services.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of the reason there is reasonable in the words put out in terms of claims, because if you bump into a situation, you really want to do it, and replacing the water heaters, whatever it is, I'm picking a number 1,500, but you find the plumber that's going to do it at 5,000. That's not going to be considered reasonable, and we're going to have a hard time challenging those kind of things.
Right.
So everybody's going to be competing. It's a very fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other resident questions?
Go home.
Okay.
Before they ask a question.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you, guys.